Imagine giving the reins of a powerful empire to a child who still needs a nap after lunch. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? Yet, history is full of examples where children were thrust into positions of enormous power, often with hilarious and disastrous results. From emperors who threw glitter-filled parties to kings who couldn't decide between schoolwork and ruling an empire, these pint-sized rulers often made decisions that were more about playtime than governance. Buckle up for a journey through time as we explore the wild, whimsical, and sometimes terrifying reigns of 6 child rulers, who definitely should have stayed in the sandbox. Elagabalus, the kid who made ancient Rome a circus. Imagine letting a 14-year-old take control of one of the world's greatest empires. That's what happened when Elagabalus became emperor of Rome in 218 AD. If you're picturing a kid who'd rather throw glitter around than deal with boring stuff like laws and politics, you're spot on. Elagabalus had zero interest in being a serious ruler. He was more interested in throwing the wildest parties Rome had ever seen, dressing up in extravagant outfits, and worshipping the sun god like it was the latest TikTok trend. Elagabalus made it his mission to shake things up, starting with religion. The Roman people were used to having traditional gods. But Elagabalus wasn't having any of that. He declared that everyone should worship his favorite deity, the sun god Elagabal, and build a massive temple for it. But he didn't stop at religious reforms. He also tried to turn the palace into a personal nightclub. Every day was like a new episode of a reality TV show, with parades, banquets, and fashion shows. If the Roman Senate didn't know better, they might have thought they'd accidentally elected a Kardashian. One of Elagabalus' most infamous moves was appointing his chariot as a high-ranking official. Yes, you read that right, his chariot. He also loved hosting parties where guests would be pelted with flower petals, until they either suffocated or just got fed up and left. His bizarre behavior became too much even for Rome, a place famous for its debauchery. After 4 years of turning the empire into a glitter-filled carnival, the grown-ups in charge decided it was time to say goodbye permanently. The teenager who thought he could rule like he was running a circus didn't see it coming. Ivan the Terrible, the baby king who grew up mean. Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, became the Grand Prince of Moscow at just 3 years old. While most toddlers are busy figuring out how to put on their own shoes, Ivan was already starting his path to becoming one of history's most feared rulers. He was the original mean kid, except instead of stealing toys, he was more into throwing animals off rooftops and pulling pranks that involved a lot of people screaming, and not in a good way. As he grew older, Ivan's taste for violence didn't mellow out. In fact, it grew stronger. When he wasn't busy holding grudges or seeing enemies everywhere, including under his bed, he created the Oprichniki, a creepy secret police force dressed in all black. These guys weren't just your regular tough guys. They had a flair for the dramatic, complete with black horses and severed dog heads hanging from their saddles. They roamed the land like a mobile nightmare, carrying out Ivan's every whim with glee. One of Ivan's most infamous decisions was the creation of the Oprichnina, a policy that split the Russian Empire into two. One half that he ruled directly, and the other half that he left to the nobles, though they were still under his thumb. If someone dared to cross him, he would deal with them and their entire family. By the end of his reign, Ivan was so paranoid and angry that he even killed his own son during an argument, proving that his terrible nickname was well earned. It turns out giving a throne to a kid who already had anger issues was a recipe for disaster. Mary, Queen of Scots, the kid queen who was really good at making bad choices. Mary, Queen of Scots, was only 6 days old when she became queen. Yep, she was barely a week old and already had more power than most people will ever have in their lives. You'd think someone with a royal title before they could even hold their own bottle would be destined for greatness, but Mary's life was more of a soap opera than a fairy tale. Raised in the French court, Mary lived in a bubble of luxury. She was the star of every ball and learned all the elegant things, from dancing to embroidery, to how to subtly insult someone with a smile. But when it came to ruling, Mary's decision-making skills were, let's just say, questionable. Her first marriage was to a spoiled French prince, and after he died, she quickly remarried. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was a total mess. A guy who thought he was God's gift to the world, but was mostly just a drunk. When Darnley was mysteriously murdered, there was a suspicious explosion followed by strangulation, because why settle for one method when you can have two? Mary wasted no time and married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, who was widely suspected of being the one behind the murder. Rather than realizing she was playing a dangerous game, Mary doubled down. This terrible decision eventually led to her downfall. She was forced to abdicate, flee to England, and ask her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, for help. Elizabeth, not exactly thrilled to have a rival claimant to the throne hanging around, had Mary locked up for 19 years. Finally, when Elizabeth decided she had enough of the drama, she ordered Mary's execution. Mary's reign is a prime example of how poor life choices and bad taste in men can ruin even the most glittering of careers. Puyi, the boy emperor who couldn't keep his toys or his throne. Puyi, the last emperor of China, ascended the throne at the ripe old age of 2. He was more like a living doll than a ruler, dressed in elaborate robes, paraded around like a showpiece, and surrounded by servants who catered to his every whim. If he wanted a particular snack, it was delivered on a golden tray. If he didn't get his way, tantrums would ensue. The Forbidden City was essentially his giant playpen. But outside its walls, China was changing rapidly, and the concept of emperors was on its way out. Puyi's life inside the palace was more like being trapped in a luxurious prison. As a child emperor, he had all the perks of royalty without any of the real power. By the time he was a teenager, the Chinese people have had enough of the imperial system and moved on, leaving Puyi out in the cold. However, Puyi's story didn't end there. He was later used as a puppet ruler by the Japanese during World War II, which only added more layers to his bizarre life. Eventually, Puyi's imperial days were behind him, and he spent the rest of his life trying to adapt to the new world. From being an emperor who could demand candy on a whim to a humble gardener working in obscurity, Puyi's story is a lesson of how quickly fortunes can change, even if you start out with a crown on your head. Edward VI, the sickly kid who never got to play long enough. Edward VI was just 9 years old when he became King of England, taking the throne after the notorious Henry VIII, his father. Edward was a pale, sickly boy who had all the energy of a wilted houseplant, but even with his fragile health, he was expected to be king and carry on his father's legacy, whether he liked it or not. Unfortunately, the job involved more religious reform than fun and games, which probably wasn't what Edward had in mind. Under his reign, England saw a push toward Protestantism, with Edward continuing his father's work of breaking away from the Catholic Church. But let's be honest, this kid didn't get to decide much on his own. His advisors were pulling all the strings while Edward tried to balance his responsibilities with his health. The poor kid never really had a chance to enjoy his childhood or experience life beyond the stiff walls of court. Edward's short reign came to an abrupt end when he died at just 15 years old, probably from tuberculosis. With so much scheming going on behind the scenes, it's a wonder he didn't die from stress. It's sad to think that his time as king was more about fighting religious battles than getting to enjoy the simple pleasures of being a kid. Edward's story is a classic example of a child ruler who was more of a figurehead than a real decision maker. A sickly kid who never got a chance to live out his childhood or his reign. Shaka, the warrior king who took playground fights way too far. Shaka Zulu wasn't a child ruler in the typical sense. He wasn't born into royalty, but clawed his way up from humble beginnings. Growing up, Shaka had a rough childhood, bullied and pushed around. But instead of breaking him, the tough upbringing turned him into one of history's fiercest warriors. By his early 20s, Shaka had transformed the Zulu kingdom into a powerful force, combining ruthless military tactics with innovative strategies. Unlike other young rulers who inherited their positions, Shaka earned his leadership through brute strength and cunning. He revolutionized warfare in his region by introducing new battle formations and training methods that turned his warriors into a nearly unstoppable force. But Shaka's intense drive and thirst for power came with a dark side. His punishments were extreme, and if you crossed him, there wasn't much hope for forgiveness. When his mother died, Shaka's grief turned into madness. He ordered that no crops be planted, no milk be consumed, and even banned people from smiling or showing any kind of happiness. His actions led to famine and suffering, making him as feared by his own people as by his enemies. Eventually, his relatives decided they couldn't take it anymore and assassinated him. Shaka's story is a mix of ambition, tragedy, and the dangers of letting unchecked power go to someone who never learned to play nicely with others. Conclusion: maybe don't let kids run things. These stories prove one thing: giving absolute power to someone who still needs help tying their shoes is bound to end in disaster. Whether they threw extravagant parties, made terrible life choices, or just went on power-hungry rampages, these child rulers show that sometimes it's better to let the grown-ups stay in charge, or at least make sure someone's keeping an eye on any kid holding a crown.